Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. For more than half a century, America's war on drugs has failed. It has been a misguided and racist crusade that hasn't stopped people from selling or using drugs, even as it's cost the government an estimated $1 trillion. And our enforcement-first approach has stigmatized addiction and drug use, it's ignored treatment, and it has empowered an out-of-control police state and an ongoing mass incarceration crisis in this country. But now, it seems that finally, lawmakers are realizing that this is not the path forward. I'm sure you're all familiar with the wave of cannabis legalization and decriminalization laws that have swept across the country. But states like Oregon have gone even further by moving to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of drugs, replacing the threat of jail time and a criminal record with a $100 fine or a health assessment that could lead to counseling for substance use disorder. Now, other states like Washington and Massachusetts are seeking to follow suit with decriminalization proposals that would apply to all substances as well. So joining me now to discuss the latest in this campaign is Cassandra Frederique, Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. Cassandra, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the Drug Policy Alliance has been a leading advocate when it comes to shifting resources away from criminalization and drug enforcement and towards things like treatment and education. Can you explain a little bit about how this sort of reprioritization can actually improve community safety, contrary to what those who believe in the status quo believe?
Yeah, so Drug Policy Alliance is a national organization. We work with groups all across the country, really trying to move and change our response to drugs. We do not believe that criminalization is an effective strategy when it comes to dealing with drug use and drug addiction. And in fact, we think that drug prohibition has set up this false choice about what we put our money into and how we can love the people that are part of our families. And so for us, our conversation is we need to end criminalization. It is not an effective tool or deterrent when it comes to use or prioritization of resources. And then we actually need to build the world that we want. So how do we get better access to treatment? How do we make sure people have the things that they need, like housing and food and family support? We know that the drug war has been used as a way to disrupt those things. And research consistently shows that drug war criminalization is actually getting us further and further away of what we hope for our communities, which is people being able to make healthy choices, as well as people being able to get help when they need it.
So talk to us a little bit more about how the drug war not just prevents people from getting the help that they need, but also how it actively harms public safety and makes it more difficult for them to do that.
So recently we just launched an initiative called Uprooting the Drug War, which really looked at different systems that the drug war has infested. And so we looked at issues of housing, of employment, of education, of immigration, of child welfare, and really showed how drug war criminalization has made it difficult for people to exist. And so when you look, we're in the middle of an overdose crisis. And one of the things that people talk about are housing and employment. And what we found was that the drug war actually makes it harder for people to be housed. It actually makes it harder for people to get employed. So, the Lancet just came out with a research paper that showed that homelessness actually increases the likelihood of people getting HIV and AIDS, Hep C, and overdoses, right? And that's because, drug war policies make it difficult for people to be a part of public housing, right? And so the drug war continues to exacerbate issues of homelessness. Or you'll just see in the White House, the President of the United States fired 5 staffers because they admitted to past use around drugs. And that's happening all across the country. And these are specific policy decisions that have been put forward where drugs are used as a way to disrupt employment or prevent employment, which are also risk factors when it comes to overdose or problematic drug use. And so I think for us, we're about looking at the bigger picture and understanding that our drug policies are not only setting us up in a way where it's getting hard for people to get help, but it's making the situations that people are in even worse. And so oftentimes people blame drugs or cite drugs as the reason why people's lives are in disarray. But what we're saying is the drug policies, our responses to drugs, are actually creating the conditions for their lives to be more destabilized.
So do you see lawmakers across the country sort of finally understanding that the fact that the criminalization of drugs perpetuates a cycle of instability? And if you do, where else do you see there being the initiative to take action to change that?
Yeah, so I think what's been really exciting is there's been this movement around cannabis legalization, and people have started really investigating the beginnings of the drug war. The person on your screen that you're seeing there is Elizabeth Owens, who was a community organizer at Vocal New York. And one of the biggest things she used to say is, thank you for coming to work today. And part of that is because our work is going to talk to elected officials and talking about how people's lives have been disrupted. And I think elected officials have seen that in a time where we've had such punitive drug policies, we're still in the midst of a devastating overdoses crisis, right? And it's like, how is it possible that we're losing so many people on drugs if we have such punitive policies? And so what we're seeing for elected officials is that these things aren't adding up, and that the strategy that we've been using hasn't actually made us safer. And so you're seeing in places like Washington, like Maine, like Maryland, like Colorado, like New York, like New Jersey, like Oregon, folks are saying, let's have a different conversation about this. Even elected officials in Virginia are like, it's time for us to start studying what the decriminalization of drugs could do for our communities. And in other places, people are introducing legislation to say, it's time. We're going to do something different. And we actually want to figure out how we can use the resources that we've used to criminalize people to actually build the help infrastructure that we need. And I think something that's really important about that is recognizing, and this is the hardest thing, which is getting people to understand that help is not supposed to come with conditions, that help is not supposed to be coercive. And I think we have a long way to go with that, because while the President of the United States, Joe Biden, will say, we don't think people should be arrested for drugs, in the same breath, he will say those people need to be forced into treatment. And that's not the direction we want to go. We want to say people need help. If people should not be arrested for drugs, and if they need help, we should give them a plethora of options, and none of those plethora of options should be remotely connected to the criminal legal system.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because, even when I look at some of these bills, and they're wonderful and great, and they're a really important step forward, even the Washington bill, it's decriminalizing drug use, but it's not legalizing it. There's still a potential civil fine, potential coercion into counseling, those sorts of things. And that sort of, to me, seems to go against what you're saying, which is it shouldn't be coercive. So why is it that this is the step that needs to happen next? And what might a fully realized shift away from drug prohibition and criminalization look like?
Yeah, and this is such a great point that you're bringing up, Alana, because I think oftentimes people conflate decriminalization and legalization. And at this moment, we're talking about decriminalization, which is removing criminal penalties. Legalization, regulation means creating and setting up a marketplace where people can access drugs. And I think that is also a relevant conversation for us to have. But at the moment, we're having the conversation around decriminalization. And what that looks like for us is fully committing to the idea that criminalization should not be a part of the response associated with drugs. That means we shouldn't be having fines. Oftentimes people put the fines in, and if you don't pay the fine, then criminalization comes. I think the thing that we're trying to do is disrupt the relationship to punishment. And so it's like, if you are going to have a fine, it should not lead to any criminalization. And that's what they did in Oregon, right? Which is like, there's a fine, but if you don't pay it, it's not like you go to jail, right? Because it's really about disrupting that relationship. It's also about making sure that the treatment that people are offered, if you fail out of treatment, that doesn't mean that you go to jail, right? And like, that's one of the things when people have looked at drug courts and have been like, yes, this is an alternative. And we're like, no, that's moving the chairs around on a sinking ship. And so for us, we're clear that there are certain things like there are certain principles around decriminalization, that decriminalization should happen for everyone. There shouldn't be an age limit. So like if you're above 21, it's decriminalized. If you're under it, you can be criminalized. No, because we know that criminalization harms young people the most, and that young people are out in the street and are most likely to be engaged by law enforcement. And so decriminalization is a youth prevention strategy. It's about preventing law enforcement from getting their hands on our young people. As someone who's from New York and watched the criminalization of cannabis, 70% of the criminalization of cannabis were under the age of 29. 52% of that was between the ages of 16 and 21. And so for us, when we're talking about decriminalization, it needs to be decrim for everyone, not just adults, but also for young people. And we can have different responses that better envelop young people to support them to make healthy choices or inform their choices, but criminalization should not be on the table. Help should not come with handcuffs or coercion, and that fines should not be something that are things that we lean on, and if you do have fines, they shouldn't engage in criminal penalties.
I'm really glad you brought up the cannabis legislation in New York. That's something that I'm really excited to talk about with you. But I thought what was really interesting about it, and I think it's important in a segment that we're talking about, where we're talking about the drug war, to acknowledge that this is a war that has been targeted on Black and Brown communities in this country. And the New York legislation has worked to repair that. And I know that's a lot of the work of the organizers who have pushed it. So can you talk a little bit about that and sort of your role in doing that?
Yeah, so we have been working on marijuana reform in New York since the mid-2000s. I joined EPA in 2009, launched the marijuana arrest campaign in 2010. And really what the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act reflects is all the lessons we've learned in the last 10, 11 years, recognizing that this conversation and the broader conversation around drug decriminalization is not about drugs at all. It is about how the state is engaging people and how the state is using drugs as a way to destabilize people's lives. The drug war is not about drugs, it's about controlling groups of people. And what you see in the New York legislation is an attempt to censor those people in the middle and say, we are going to remove cannabis as a way that destabilizes your lives, that gets you kicked out of housing, that makes you lose your job, that makes you lose custody of your kids, that gets you arrested. We're going to remove that. And not only are we going to remove that, but we're going to take the money that comes from a regulated market and put it back into those same communities where they experience divestment, but also experience overinvestment in criminalization. And now we're saying this money, 40% of the tax revenues, are going to be put back into the communities that felt the brunt of community destabilization through our policies. 40% of the money is going to go to education, really focusing on building up the infrastructure that we know is helpful to reduce risk assessments for people getting into trouble. And also recognizing that if we are going to create an industry based on a product that was illegal before, that was also used to target certain groups of people, that the economic justice, that the economic prosperity and opportunities have to be as targeted as the criminalization. And so that is the attempt that the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act is doing. It also really pushes back on what we've seen cannabis reforms do right now, where we see that law enforcement adjusts the way that they use cannabis as a way to engage people. And so they've used the odor of cannabis as a way to engage people. And we're saying, no, you cannot use cannabis odor anymore to engage people and arrest people. We know this to be true because this is a strategy they use for Philando Castile. Right now, in the trial of George Floyd, that attorney shamedly, it is disgusting and dastardly the way that they are trying to say drugs is what killed George Floyd. Drugs didn't kill George Floyd. That man's needed. Right? And so really using the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act as a way to remove these tools from law enforcement as a justification for the killing of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this country.
Well, that is a huge accomplishment that that this was able to move forward, and congratulations on that. And also thank you for all the great work that you've been doing and for being here on our show today. Let's hope that it takes hold in other places and with full legalization around the country.
Thank you.
So this conversation today has sort of been an important reminder of how the criminalization of drugs has done everything that its lawmakers have said it's not supposed to do. It hasn't kept people safe, and it's actually reduced stability for people. Because when you are arrested for possessing a small amount of drugs, it then goes on your criminal record, prevents you from seeking housing, prevents you from seeking help, and then just leads into a larger cycle of instability. But we're seeing places like Washington, Oregon, who could potentially recreate stability in a system that has for so long hurt people in their states. And we're also seeing that there's other legislation in other areas that's also working to, in addition to create that stability, to repair the harm that criminalization has done to communities who have been affected by it. So we can only hope that these laws continue to take hold throughout the country, and that there is the support of incredible organizers continuing to push them forward. That's all the time we have for right now. Thank you so much for joining us on the Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Until then, we'll see you next time.